We've also been very busy creating lots and lots of documents for our museum accreditation. And so we had to put down in writing a lot of things about what we believe and what we're doing. And we've named our values. And our values are welcome, justice, inclusion, partnership, and good stewardship, ensuring relevance, integrity, and sustainability. So I hope those values chime with you in your churches and circuits. And those values are the values of the primitive Methodists. Next slide, please, Rob. So the primitive Methodist values were rooted in spirit-driven worship and in spirit-driven prayer and practice. The founders, Hugh Vaughan and William Clowes, both ordinary working men, their motivation was personal spiritual transformation. And as such, in the very early days, this is sort of around 1803, 1805, they were drawn to a group known as the Magic Methodists of Delamere Forest. A derogatory term that they took us on. And in our new spirituality room, I'm going to be plugging quite a lot as I go through my presentation, we explore the changing nature of primitive Methodist spirituality from this early time of spirit-led mysticism to more formal theological education of prim ministers. Now, this picture that you can see behind me is of Lorenzo Dow. He was an American evangelist who had a great deal of influence on Hugh Vaughan in particular. And this engraving is entitled Lorenzo Dow and the Jerking Exercise. I like it a lot. You'll notice that the people are falling down and sort of, having a moment. And this was the effect he had on his hearers. Now, Vaughan knew Lorenzo Dow, he was much influenced by him, and he'd heard about these Magic Methodists in Delamere Forest and all these goings on, because there was quite a lot of jerking and stuff like that. And he was a bit concerned that it was of the devil, that there was witchcraft and what have you. But although he was a very straightforward man, Hugh Vaughan decided to go investigate. And he visited them at Delamere Forest and their leader, James Crawford, with an open mind. And he was completely taken by them. There were women having visions and prophecies, there were dreams and all sorts of quite radical mystical experiences, and the spirit was very much amongst the Forest Methodists, as they were properly termed. And James Crawford became both Hugh Vaughan's and William Clowes' mentor, and became one of the early leaders of primitive Methodism. And J. Walford, one of Vaughan's biographers, actually wrote, "We cannot help but feel grateful to the donor of all good, who in his wise providence first led Hugh Vaughan beneath the shelter of the old man's cottage," that's James Crawford, "in the forest of Delamere. For there he found an invaluable treasure, viz. An insight into the deep things of God, with which, with all his piety, learning and deep theological research, he was previously unacquainted." So Hugh Vaughan, a straightforward man who liked to do things by the book, who was an inquirer, a researcher, he had read so greatly and had all this theological research, and it wasn't until he went to the forest, until he met people like Lorenzo Dow and James Crawford, that he actually really became filled with the Holy Spirit and understood that there is something other than words. Now, the next slide, please. I don't know where I'm looking. Where is it? Oh, it's there. I was looking up there. I thought you were up there. Now, you may recognise this from the Old Testament. This is a painting of Jacob's ladder, where we have a ladder that he dreams about that reaches from earth to heaven, and the angels are going up and down. And the reason why we've got this is a bit of a warning. This was one of the very common visions experienced by the imagined Methodists, by the women. And it was actually known as the head of the church vision. And they wouldn't see angels going up and down the ladder, they would see the preachers. So the local preachers and the travelling preachers. And who was at the top of the ladder depended very much on who was the most popular preacher or who had the most influence. So very often Lorenzo Dow was at the top, and James Crawford, and William Clowes, a very charismatic preacher. Hugh Bourne was often down at the bottom. You see, Hugh Bourne was a very timid preacher, and he wasn't terribly good in front of a crowd. It was great if he spoke to you one-to-one, apparently, but not so good as a preacher. So he was often down at the bottom. So you can imagine that this kind of vision that was supposed to come from God about who was the most popular preacher at the time could be very divisive and could cause a lot of upset and consternation. So there's just a little warning there that even the great primitive Methodists sometimes fell into a bit of a trap. Next slide, please. So this is a picture, an old engraving of the Cheshire side of Mount Cop. So you probably don't recognise it because you can't actually see the castle at the top of the mountain there. It's not really a mountain. And you're probably aware that the very first camp meeting was held at Mount Cop in 1807 on the 31st of May. It was one of many that followed, not just at Mount Cop, but throughout Cheshire and North Staffordshire. And it was Lorenzo Dow who encouraged Hugh Bourne to hold this meeting. Because camp meetings were very big in America. And so he said, you know, this is how you organise it. But Hugh Bourne was very reticent. He wanted people to hear the gospel. He wanted people to have the experience that he had in the forest and in other places. And it was his cousin, Daniel Shoebottom, who was a collier, who with some friends convinced Hugh Bourne that a day of prayer on Mount Cop would bring revival, that the Spirit would fall upon them. And these men, these colliers, wanted a day of prayer because they had experienced exclusion from the chapels and churches. They had not been welcome. And they had recognised that they needed the gospel of liberation. And the only way they felt that it was going to come about was if they took this step, which was a dangerous step because the authorities, the government at this time, did not want working class people gathered together in crowds. They were frightened of revolution. And Hugh Bourne was frightened that he might lose his licence as a nonconformist to worship, because that was under the largesse of the king. But again, Hugh Bourne, although a very straightforward man, decided to step out in faith. And the first camp meeting happened at Mount Cop, and thousands were converted that day. And he recognised there was a real hunger among ordinary people who were so marginalised because of their working patterns, because they were considered too lowly or dirty to enter the chapels and churches. He recognised that they needed leadership and they needed the gospel. Excellent. And they met in all sorts of places, because they didn't all have chapels. And you may recognise, this is our new spirituality room. It's all been painted and everything, it's lovely. And you might recognise, if you've been to Englesea Brook, the first primitive Methodist pulpit, which is that cabinet. And this came from a kitchen of a man called John Smith, who wasn't a prim, but he allowed the nonconformists, they weren't primitive Methodists at this time, the nonconformists, Hugh Bourne and William Clowes and others, to meet in his kitchen. And apparently he made this pulpit himself out of a kitchen cabinet, and we think the top is maybe the side of a cradle. And he made this because the meetings were so rowdy, because suddenly people were really feeling something happening, and the Spirit was amongst them and within them, and they would just shout out and pray and want to give their testimonies. And William Clowes particularly was very keen on just speaking out when he felt the Spirit was leading him to do this. And he wouldn't shut up. So John Smith made this out of his cupboard. And he said, right, when we have our meetings, if you want to speak, you stand behind the pulpit and everybody else must be quiet. William Clowes said, no, I'm not doing that. When the Spirit leads, I'm going to speak. And apparently there's an anecdote that on one occasion John Smith actually had to push his fist into William Clowes' mouth to stop him. But this was the nature of their spirituality. They were so full that, they were going for it, they really were. And they met in all sorts of different places, out of doors, in the camp meetings, in kitchens. And could I have the next slide, please, Rob? And you may have noticed, if you were eagle-eyed, next to the pulpit were some hat boxes. Now, this is one of my favourite stories. A society of primitive Methodists, because they were primitive Methodists by this time, was formed in Carlisle in the 1820s, and they met outside. Well, I've not been to Carlisle, but I believe it's quite northerly. And the weather was a bit chilly. So they had to find somewhere a little bit nicer to meet. So they were offered a room in a hat factory. And they built their pulpit whenever they had their services out of hat boxes. Isn't that brilliant? And it was described as being neither easy of access nor particularly secure. But our fathers, they continue, did not depend on ornate sanctuaries and on elaborate ritual, another warning there. And the old hat factory was hallowed by many, a heart-stirring demonstration of the power of divine grace. And apparently William Clowes, in 1822, preached at that pulpit, the hat box pulpit. I just think that's such a demonstration of creativity and improvisation, that actually, where the Spirit is moving and the people are gathered, you can use whatever's at hand. Next slide, please. So we can't talk about primitive Methodist spirituality and their history without mentioning children's spirituality and the value placed on it by Bourne in particular. He wrote extensively about preaching to children, and he understood well their unique contribution to the life of the church. And those words at the bottom of one of the banners that's hanging in the chapel this year, "Feed my lambs." That was his gospel motto. It appears on lots of teaching plans and all sorts of things, and he would use it often. Feed my lambs. And the investment that Hugh Bourne made, both in time and his own money, into the Sunday schools is astounding. He would produce magazines and pamphlets to further secular and religious education, and he spent time being with the children, teaching them about the world and God. And he insisted that they were prominent when they processioned. They would go through the towns, and basically having a service on the hoof. And they would stop at various points in towns and cities, and they would pray, or they would have a few minutes of preaching, and he was very particular about how they timed this, by the way. And they would eventually talk to the chapel by the time they reached the chapel, wherever it was, Clement Hat Factory, wherever it was they were meeting. But he was really insistent that children were there and that they were praying and even preaching as well, not just to their peers, but to adults. So he really valued children's curiosity and spirituality, because I think it was very much like his own. Although he was a bit of a timid man, he was so curious about the world and about God, and he wanted to share that with all. And at Englesea Brook, we are putting that vision about children and their curiosity in practice at Englesea Brook. We have now, for a few years, had partnership with special schools and with groups of disabled adults and with other marginalised groups who perhaps heritage is not something they would be able to access, and certainly not perhaps churches for many reasons, because obviously a worship service is a noisy place. It's a joyful place, but it's not always easily accessible for everybody. So we've been inviting small groups to the Chapel Museum for a long time now. And we're going to extend this. We're hoping to be registered as an alternative provision. And this would be to give very small groups of primary and secondary students the opportunity to learn in a new creative way, using our primitive Methodist stories, so they can learn about how to value one another, how to regulate themselves. They can learn about science, they can learn about, obviously, RE, they can learn about the outside world, about heritage, lots and lots of things that we can teach them. And we've also recently been awarded a grant from the Royal Society as part of their Places of Science scheme. And we're going to be offering home-educated children and families 10 sessions, again, using all our primitive Methodist resources and stories, so they can learn about the world, the natural environment and science, because Hugh Bourne is particularly keen on all of that. So we're putting the Prim's vision and Hugh Bourne's vision of supporting the marginalised and working with children who perhaps don't have access to education for lots of different reasons into practice at Englesea Brook. And this year marks, as I've said, the centenary of the general strike. And we focused on the pottery riots of 1842 because there was quite a lot of Prim involvement. Because by this time, the Prims had recognised that to live the gospel of Christ is not only about personal spiritual transformation, it's about cultural and societal transformation. That the ordinary working people who are creating much of the wealth for a very privileged minority needed a voice. So the Charter, calling for universal male suffrage, and there were women chartists who called for women's suffrage, among other parliamentary reform, was one such vehicle. And local charters were involved in the strike of colliery workers, which then spread to many other trades and spread throughout the country. Now, there was a riot in Burslem. I believe there's a plaque outside, as pointed out. It was violent, there was death. Come to the presentation of strike and you will hear all about it. Perhaps rioting is not the best approach, but the Prims were activists, and activism became part of the Prim belief. Next slide, please. The best way, next slide, please. Thank you. The best way, it might be argued, is one that was demonstrated 60 years later by Reverend Edward Clements. He was a passive resistor. He and many other nonconformists objected to the 1902 Education Act, which insisted on rates being collected to subsidise church schools. And rate refusal began in 1903. Clements would not pay the Huddersfield Borough rate of 6 shillings 9pence, as it would be used, he believed, for sectarian religious purpose. So his cruet set, which we have in the museum, was seized in lieu of payment. His congregation raised the money to get it back. Not once, but on several occasions. Now this is quite a funny story. It's lovely, isn't it? The cruet set. But it's a serious matter. 170 passive resistors were sent to prison. 60 of them were Prims, 15 were Wesleyan Methodists. So it wasn't just a nice little story. You know, Clements and others were prepared to be jailed for their beliefs. Another peaceful resistance, we know of course, came in the form of conscientious objection in World War I. Now the Prim Church was known as one of the most pacifist denominations. It objected to the arms trade, the Boer Wars, and all this changed on the eve of World War I, when Reverend Guttery, who a year later, in 1915, would become president of the Prim Conference, gave a speech calling on young primitive Methodist men to enlist. Instead of king and country, it was a just war. Just a few weeks before, he had been preaching against plunging into an insane war. But he changed. He had been swayed by Lord Lloyd George with the promise of temperance legislation, which never came about. Many resisted in the pews, however, and many went to prison as conscientious objectors. But this was a shift, really, in the primitive Methodist Church from peacemakers to jingoism, and I don't think the Church ever really recovered. Last. Thank you. So I'll just conclude with this photograph from the 1929, bringing it up almost to Union in 1932. This is from the Primitive Methodist Missionary Reports, and it's entitled Picking Up a Lost Thread, and it refers to prison ministry, to advocates, poor man's lawyers and court missionaries. Court missionaries, many Prims were court missionaries, and in 1907, when the probation service was formed, that role became the probation officer. And these were people who would stand alongside those who were either facing court or had come out of prison, often because of drink and other addictions, and they would help them to rehabilitate themselves, to find jobs, employment, perhaps reconciliation with family members. And temperance played a big part, a long tradition in the Prim Church, that the evils of drink were well documented. And we entitled an exhibition at School Partnership, Picking Up a Lost Thread. We made some films with some young people about alcohol and other addictions. Because we recognised that something very small can make everything unravel, and it can be easily overlooked. So we have to be very careful to make sure we recognise the detail. They say God is in the detail, don't they? And I think at Englesea Brook, that's what we look for. We look for those little details which can actually lead to a much bigger picture. And this exhibition and these videos came about after another travelling exhibition that we partnered with the National Probation Service. I'm sure you're aware of this. And we were given extra funding. We were asked if we would like extra funding because that exhibition was so successful to do this. And this is what we chose, to work with young people so that they would have an understanding about how addiction can damage lives. And our probation service exhibition was entitled Root and Branch, which seems appropriate. because the roots were those values that I stated at the very beginning, the values of the primitive Methodists, to seek justice and to be inclusive and to recognise the marginalised and to walk alongside them. And that's what the Primitives were. And we know that that's what probation officers do today. So from the roots of primitive Methodism, which obviously are in this area, there are so many branches, and at Englesea Brook, I hope that we are living out those branches by reaching out to marginalised groups and helping particularly young people to understand about our history. History that sometimes people shy away from because it's religious. No, it's human. That's all it is. At Englesea Brook, which we're celebrating 40 years at the museum this year as well. At Englesea Brook, we are living that out day by day. So please come to our museum, see what we've done, and there will be a very warm welcome for all of you. Thank you.